In exercise 212, we have an issue here where we have several different potential allocation bases for manufacturing overhead. Now, unlike direct materials and direct labor, which can be identified and traced to products, overhead has to be allocated, by its nature of being an indirect product cost. So here, the expected manufacturing overhead amount is determined at the beginning of the year, and then we take various bases, either direct labor hours, direct labor cost, machine hours, or material costs, and use those as an allocation base. So every time a certain event takes place, so every time we have a direct labor hour, we would allocate a certain amount to overhead. So in part A of this problem for Weber Fabricating, we have to determine our predetermined overhead rate under the various bases. So for direct labor hours as our allocation base, we would take our expected overhead amount and divide by 40,000. So this would be $25 per direct labor hour. So both are important here, both the $25 and the direct labor hours, so that we, as an allocation base. Now in Excel, you have to have the number and the text in different cells, but I'm putting this in the same box so that to emphasize that this is certainly important, that every time we have this event, every time we work direct labor, we have direct labor cost, but then we also have, if we use direct labor hours as the allocation base, we have $25 in overhead that's being used as our estimate of the cost for overhead. So if we hit the F2 key here, what we can do is we can see that for each of these allocation bases, we would have a common numerator, that is the $1 million of expected overhead costs. So if using the F4 key, we would absolute cell reference there, so that as we copy this formula down, let's see how well we can do that. I guess we don't need that one right here for overhead, but as we copy this down, what we see is that we have $1.60. So in this case, 1 million divided by 625,000, so $1.60 per direct labor cost, or dollar. Machine hours would be $50 per machine hour, and then material cost would be $1.25 per dollar of material. Now each of these is going to be, each of these are presented for demonstration purposes. So but really what you want to keep in mind is that a lot of companies will, when you're looking at a volume-based measure like any of these, a lot of times we would see direct labor hours, material hours, or I'm sorry, machine hours being the most common allocation basis. But the dollar per dollar material per direct labor cost or dollar, that would be something that we can encounter from time to time. So in the second part, we have a particular job 253, where we have been given direct material costs, direct labor costs, and then we are asked how much in terms of manufacturing overhead we should encounter. So this is going to be a different amount depending on the allocation method. So if we put over here in column E, activity for job 253, So the number of direct labor hours worked, here we had 150 hours. The direct labor cost is 150 hours multiplied by $12 per hour, or $1,800. The number of machine hours used was 150, and the dollar amount of the direct materials was $3,000. So again, this is a dollar amount here. So for each of these potential candidates, so direct labor hours, direct labor cost, machine hours, and material cost, the amount for direct materials will be the $3,000 of material cost. So it doesn't matter what the allocation mechanism is. Each of these will be $3,000 when we're talking about the direct material costs. Similarly, direct labor costs will be $1,800, which was the dollar amount paid for direct labor. So these will be the same as well. So when we're coming up with the total job cost for job 253, direct materials and direct labor will be identical. The only difference will come in, or may come in, the case of manufacturing overhead. So the amount of overhead that we would apply or allocate to job 253 using direct labor hours as a basis would be the product of our predetermined overhead rate, $25 per direct labor hour, multiplied by the number of direct labor hours on this particular job. So $25 multiplied by 150 direct labor hours, or 3,750. So similarly, we could do the same. We could do the $1.60 per direct labor cost multiplied by 1,800. We end up with 2,880. Notice that that's a bit smaller, almost 50% lower. If we use machine hours, we have $50 per machine hour multiplied by $150. Now we get twice as much as the initial one under direct labor. And then material cost would be $1.25 per dollar of material multiplied by $3,000, and we get $3,750. So when we look at the total job cost here, it would be $8,550 for under direct labor hours, as well as material cost. But machine hours gives a much higher estimate, and direct labor cost gives a lower estimate. So you want to be careful as far as that's concerned, because you want to, and this is part of the issue in terms of how you're costing your products, is that the allocation mechanism or method, or direct labor hours, machine hours, direct labor cost, material cost, is going to create some sort of process under which we cost our products. So if we are using machine hours, and this particular job uses potentially more machine hours proportionally, well then what we see is that we're going to have more cost being charged to this particular job. Maybe that's true. But we won't know that until after the fact. So, the idea here in using a predetermined overhead rate is to contemporaneously charge an amount into work in process for overhead costs. And this could be wildly sensitive, or sensitive to these different estimates, and there could be wild swings in terms of the amount of cost that would be moving through as overhead. I guess, again, this is an estimate. We will only know this after the fact. Now, just a moment about the material costs and direct labor hours. We have two different allocation bases which end up giving us the exact amount of manufacturing overhead. That's coincidence. This is something that you wouldn't expect to be the case. If indeed there were this sort of relationship, then why would we even use one or the other? One over the other, we would just use the first one, perhaps the direct labor hours that we had there. Sometimes textbook problems end up with this sort of circumstance. Generally speaking, if you have a different allocation base, you're likely to have a different amount in overhead.